The waitress helped the millionaire close a big deal during a business dinner. However, what happened left everyone speechless. Allison Reed tightened the apron around her waist, her fingers moving deftly as she tied the knot. The faint aroma of garlic and freshly baked bread filled the bustling kitchen of La Belle Maison, one of Chicago's most luxurious restaurants. The evening was just beginning, and the staff hurried to prepare for the onslaught of wealthy clientele who would soon flood the dining room. "Allison, table 4 just asked for water," a coworker barked as he rushed past, carrying a tray of appetizers. She nodded without hesitation, picking up a pitcher and making her way to the table. The couple seated there barely acknowledged her presence, their attention glued to their phones. It was a scene Allison had grown used to, people engrossed in their own worlds, viewing her as little more than a shadow moving through the room. Her shifts at La Belle Maison were long and demanding, but they paid for her classes at the University of Chicago. Allison was a junior majoring in economics, and when she wasn't at the restaurant, she was buried in textbooks or practicing her Mandarin. Mastering languages had been her quiet obsession for years. French and Spanish had come easily, but Mandarin had been a greater challenge, one she'd conquered with persistence. "Excuse me," a man's voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Mr. Wilson, the manager, standing in the doorway to the kitchen. His expression was pinched, and he gestured for her to come closer. "We have a situation," he said, his voice barely audible over the clatter of plates and silverware. "You might be able to help." Curiosity piqued. Allison followed him toward a private dining room tucked away at the back of the restaurant. As she entered, her gaze landed on a group of sharply dressed individuals seated around a large polished table. At the head was a man she recognized instantly, Daniel Hughes, even if his face hadn't been splashed across every financial magazine in the country. His commanding presence and tailored suit would have made it obvious. He exuded power and control, the type of man who seemed untouchable. "These are important clients," Mr. Wilson whispered. "They're here for a business dinner, but their interpreter hasn't shown up. You know Mandarin, don't you?" Allison's stomach clenched. She glanced at the group again, noting the tension in the air. Several members of the delegation were speaking in hurried Mandarin, their expressions frustrated. Daniel Hughes remained silent, his eyes narrowing as he observed the conversation. "I do," she replied cautiously, "but I'm not a professional interpreter." "That doesn't matter," Mr. Wilson interrupted. "We need you to try. They're about to leave, and this deal could be worth millions." Allison hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Then she squared her shoulders. "Okay," she said, stepping into the room. The conversation came to an abrupt halt as the group turned to look at her. Daniel's piercing gaze was the hardest to meet, but she forced herself to hold it. "I heard there's an issue with communication," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves coursing through her. "I speak Mandarin. If you'd like, I can help." One of the Chinese businessmen raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but he nodded toward Daniel. "What do you think?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. "Fine," he said finally. "Let's see what you can do." Allison swallowed hard and took a seat at the table. As the businessmen resumed their discussion, she translated with precision, her voice calm and assured. The technical jargon of the contract was challenging, but she navigated it with surprising ease, her years of studying economics lending her a crucial edge. At one point, one of the investors attempted to gloss over a clause that would have placed Daniel's company at a significant disadvantage. Allison caught the discrepancy immediately. "Actually," she interjected in Mandarin, "that clause appears to contradict the terms outlined earlier. Could we clarify?" The room fell silent. Daniel's sharp gaze flicked to her, his expression unreadable. The investor stammered before offering a sheepish explanation, which Allison translated seamlessly. The tension in the room eased as the conversation moved forward, and by the end of the meeting, the deal was salvaged. "Thank you," Daniel said as the businessmen departed. His tone was neutral, but there was a flicker of something, respect, in his eyes. "That was impressive." Allison offered a polite nod, her heart still racing. "I'm glad I could help." As she returned to the kitchen, the gravity of what had just happened began to sink in. She had stepped out of the shadows, even if only for a moment, and made an impact in a world far removed from her own. Little did she know that one act of courage would change her life forever. The next evening at La Belle Maison was quieter than usual. The atmosphere subdued after the buzz of the previous night's high-stakes meeting. Allison moved between tables with her usual grace, balancing plates and glasses with practiced ease. Yet, her mind kept wandering back to the events of the night before. The way Daniel Hughes had looked at her, curious, almost appraising, lingered in her thoughts. "Allison," Mr. Wilson called from the front desk, waving her over with a sense of urgency. She placed her tray down and made her way to him, smoothing her apron out of habit. "There's someone here to see you," he said, lowering his voice. "Daniel Hughes." Her stomach flipped. "What?" she blurted, blinking at him in disbelief. "He's waiting in the private dining room," Wilson continued, his tone tinged with both awe and nerves. "And he specifically asked for you." Allison felt a rush of heat climb up her neck. It wasn't every day that a man of Daniel Hughes' stature showed up for anything, let alone to speak with a waitress. She took a steadying breath and followed Wilson's gesture toward the private room, her heart hammering in her chest. When she entered, Daniel was seated alone at the same polished table from the night before. A sleek leather briefcase sat on the chair beside him, and his expression was as composed as ever. He glanced up as she approached, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "Miss Reed," he said, standing and extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." Allison shook his hand, her palm slightly clammy. "Of course. How can I help you?" He gestured for her to sit, and she complied, suddenly hyper-aware of the casual elegance of his tailored suit compared to her modest uniform. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of conversation from the main dining area. "I've been thinking about last night," he began, his tone measured. "Your intervention not only saved that deal, but also uncovered details even my most trusted advisors missed. I did some digging afterward, and discovered you're studying economics." Allison blinked, her cheeks flushing. "That's true," she admitted. "I'm a junior at the University of Chicago." He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the table. "Your knowledge, your composure under pressure, and your language skills, they're rare. I believe you have potential beyond this restaurant." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into her. "Thank you," she said cautiously, unsure of where this was going. "I want to offer you a position at my company," he said plainly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Consultant, focusing on international negotiations. The pay will be substantial, and you'll have the opportunity to work with some of the brightest minds in the industry." Allison stared at him, her mind racing. This was not just an opportunity. It was a life-altering proposal, but alongside the exhilaration came a wave of doubt. She had no corporate experience, no polished resume. Could she really step into a world so far removed from her own? "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Say yes," Daniel replied, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I wouldn't offer this if I didn't believe you could handle it." Allison bit her lip, her thoughts a whirlwind. She couldn't deny the appeal of the offer, nor the validation it represented. Yet, a part of her hesitated, clinging to the familiar rhythm of her current life, however modest it might be. "Why me?" she finally asked. "You could hire someone with a polished resume and years of experience." Daniel's expression softened, though his intensity remained. "Because talent and drive matter more than a piece of paper. You proved that last night, and frankly, I trust people who've had to fight for their place in the world." The sincerity in his words struck a chord in her. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what life could be like outside the confines of the restaurant. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. "Can I think about it?" she asked. Daniel nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Take your time, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait forever." Back in the kitchen, Allison leaned against the counter, her mind still spinning. She replayed the conversation over and over, dissecting his words. The other waitstaff gave her curious glances, but she offered no explanation, guarding the moment as something too fragile to share. That night, as she walked home through the quiet streets of Chicago, she turned the offer over in her mind. It wasn't just about the job. It was about stepping into a world she'd only glimpsed from the outside. A world where her potential might finally be recognized. The decision weighed heavily on her, but deep down, she knew that her life was at a crossroads, and no matter which path she chose, There would be no turning back. The sun was just beginning to rise over Chicago as Allison sat at the small desk in her apartment, staring at the business card Daniel Hughes had given her. His name, embossed in sleek silver letters, seemed to stare back at her, daring her to make a decision. The weight of his offer pressed on her chest like a physical force. Could she really step into a world so far removed from the one she knew? Her entire life had been a balancing act, juggling her studies, her shifts at La Belle Maison, and the constant effort to stay afloat financially. This offer was a lifeline, a chance to escape the grind, but it was also terrifying. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from her best friend. "Lisa," flashed on the screen. "Lunch today. You've been Mia." Allison smiled faintly, texting back a quick yes. She needed someone to talk to, someone who could help her make sense of the chaos in her mind. By noon, Allison found herself sitting across from Lisa at a cozy cafe near campus. Lisa was the kind of friend who radiated warmth and energy, her curly red hair and wide smile lighting up any room she entered. "You've been quiet lately," Lisa said, raising an eyebrow as she sipped her coffee. "What's going on? You're not secretly eloping or something, are you?" Allison laughed, shaking her head. "Not even close, something happened at work. And it's kind of big." Lisa leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "Big how? Did someone leave you a massive tip? Or did a celebrity show up?" "It's bigger than that," Allison said, her voice lowering. She hesitated before explaining everything. The chaotic dinner, her impromptu translation, and Daniel Hughes's unexpected offer. By the time she finished, Lisa was staring at her, wide-eyed. "Allison," she said, her tone a mix of disbelief and excitement. "This is huge. You'd be crazy not to take it." "But what if I'm not ready?" Allison asked, her doubts spilling out. "What if I mess it up? I don't know anything about working in a corporate office." "Are you kidding?" Lisa said, shaking her head. "You've been balancing school, work, and life for years. If anyone can handle this, it's you. Plus, you're brilliant. You speak 3 freaking languages. Do you know how rare that is?" Allison smiled, but her nerves lingered. It's a big risk. What if I fail?" Lisa reached across the table, grabbing Allison's hand. "What if you don't? Look, you've been dreaming about doing something meaningful with your life, right? This is your chance. Don't let fear stop you." Later that evening, Allison found herself back at her desk, the card still in her hand. Lisa's words echoed in her mind. "Don't let fear stop you." With a deep breath, she picked up her phone and dialed the number. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Daniel Hughes's office. This is Marcy speaking." "Hi, this is Allison Reed," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Hughes." "Of course, Miss Reed," Marcy replied. "Please hold for a moment." The line clicked, and a few seconds later, Daniel's voice came through, calm and assured. "Miss Reed, I didn't expect to hear from you so soon. I've been thinking about your offer," she began, her grip on the phone tightening. "And I'd like to accept." There was a pause, and for a moment, Allison wondered if she'd made the right choice. But then Daniel spoke, his tone carrying a hint of approval. "Good. I'll have my assistant send you the details. We'll get you started right away." As the call ended, Allison set her phone down, her heart pounding. She had taken the leap. There was no turning back now. The following week passed in a blur of preparations. Allison handed in her notice at La Belle Maison, much to Mr. Wilson's dismay, and organized her schedule to balance her new job with her remaining classes when Monday morning arrived. She found herself standing in front of a gleaming office building in downtown Chicago, clutching a folder of documents and trying to calm her nerves. The lobby was sleek and modern, with marble floors and glass walls that reflected the sunlight streaming in. Allison approached the reception desk, where a poised woman in a navy blazer greeted her. "You must be Miss Reed," the woman said with a polite smile. "Mr. Hughes is expecting you. Please follow me." Allison followed the woman to a conference room on the 15th floor. The walls were lined with bookshelves and framed photos of Daniel shaking hands with influential figures. At the center of the room was a long table, where Daniel sat with several other executives. "Allison," Daniel said, rising to greet her. "Welcome to Hughes Enterprises." Her pulse quickened as she stepped into the room. The eyes of the executives lingered on her, some curious, others skeptical, but Daniel's steady gaze gave her a sense of reassurance. "Let's get started," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. As the meeting began, Allison listened intently, taking notes and absorbing every detail. It was a whirlwind of unfamiliar terms and high-level strategies, but she refused to let her nerves show. By the end of the session, she had asked several insightful questions, earning an approving nod from Daniel. When the meeting adjourned, Daniel pulled her aside. "You did well today," he said. "Keep that up, and you'll go far." For the first time, Allison felt a spark of confidence. She had taken the first step into a new world, and while it was daunting, it also held endless possibilities. The hum of conversation and the quiet tapping of keyboards filled the air as Allison settled into her new workspace. The open office layout was a far cry from the bustling kitchen of La Belle Maison. Instead of clattering dishes and hurried orders, this environment thrived on precision and focus. The subtle scent of coffee and the faint rustle of papers added to the atmosphere of efficiency. Allison's desk was small but neatly organized, equipped with a sleek laptop and a stack of files labeled with terms she barely recognized. It was her first full day at Hughes Enterprises, and the weight of expectations pressed heavily on her shoulders. Though the other employees had been cordial enough, she could feel their curiosity and skepticism lingering in every glance. She adjusted her chair and opened the first file. The technical jargon within was intimidating, a stark reminder of how much she still had to learn. But Allison was no stranger to challenges. She took a deep breath, grabbed a notebook, and began deciphering the unfamiliar terms, one by one. Mid-morning, a tap on her desk startled her. She looked up to see a tall woman with sharp features and an even sharper suit. Her auburn hair was pulled into a sleek bun, and her gaze was cool and assessing. "You must be Allison Reed," the woman said, her tone neutral but edged with curiosity. "I'm Vanessa Blake, head of international relations." Allison stood, extending a hand. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Blake." Vanessa shook her hand briefly before crossing her arms. "Daniel has a lot of faith in you, which is interesting considering your background." The word stung, but Allison kept her expression composed. "I'm here to prove I can handle this." Vanessa tilted her head, as if measuring Allison's resolve. "We'll see. There's a team meeting in 15 minutes. Make sure you're prepared." As Vanessa walked away, Allison felt the familiar flicker of self-doubt, but she quickly shook it off, reminding herself that she had earned her place here. She gathered her notes and headed to the conference room. The meeting was intense. Daniel led the discussion, outlining plans for an upcoming negotiation with a European partner. The room buzzed with ideas, strategies, and rapid-fire questions. Allison observed carefully, taking in the dynamics of the team. Vanessa was assertive, her comments precise and occasionally cutting, while others deferred to Daniel's leadership with a mix of respect and caution. Toward the end of the meeting, Daniel turned his attention to Allison. "Miss Reed, any thoughts?" The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She reviewed her notes quickly before speaking. "I noticed there's a clause in the preliminary agreement that seems ambiguous," she began, her voice steady. "It could be interpreted in a way that leaves us vulnerable to additional costs. I think it's worth clarifying before we move forward." Vanessa raised an eyebrow, but Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good catch," he said. "We'll make sure that's addressed." The tension in Allison's chest eased slightly as the meeting wrapped up. She had taken a risk, and it had paid off. At least for now, by lunchtime, Allison was mentally exhausted. She found a quiet corner in the break room, her sandwich untouched as she flipped through her notes. The realization of just how steep the learning curve was hit her again, but she reminded herself that growth never came without discomfort. "You survived the meeting," a voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see a man about her age, his dark hair slightly tousled and a playful grin on his face. He held a cup of coffee in one hand and extended the other toward her. "I'm Greg," he said. "Marketing team. You're Allison, right?" She shook his hand, grateful for the friendly gesture. "That's me. Nice to meet you. Word around the office is you're Daniel's new protege," he said, sitting across from her. "That's kind of a big deal. People are curious about you." Allison shrugged, trying to downplay the attention. I'm just trying to do my job. Well, for what it's worth, that comment you made in the meeting? Impressive. Vanessa doesn't usually let things slide, but she didn't have much to say after that. Allison smiled faintly. Thanks. I wasn't sure how it would go. Greg leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of his coffee. You'll be fine. Just don't let the pressure get to you. And if you ever need help navigating the corporate jungle, let me know. She appreciated his easygoing demeanor, a welcome contrast to the high-stakes energy surrounding her. As he left, she felt a little less isolated. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tasks, emails, and moments of quiet frustration as Allison tried to wrap her head around the intricacies of her new role. By the time she left the office, the sun was setting, casting the city in a warm orange glow. Walking home, she reflected on the day's highs and lows. It hadn't been perfect. There had been moments of uncertainty and doubt, but she had made it through. And she had learned something valuable. She could hold her own in this unfamiliar world. As she approached her apartment, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. Good work today. Keep it up. Allison stared at the screen, a small smile playing on her lips. It wasn't much, but coming from him, it felt significant. She typed a quick reply. Thank you, I will. Before slipping her phone back into her pocket, she had taken another step forward, and for the first time, she began to believe that she might actually belong in this world. Allison arrived at the office early the next morning, determined to build on the progress she had made. The quiet hum of the space felt different now, less intimidating, and more like a challenge she was ready to tackle. She settled at her desk, her notebook open, and her laptop booting up, when an email from Vanessa Blake popped into her inbox. The subject line read, Presentation, preparation, urgent. Allison's stomach tightened as she clicked on it. The email detailed an assignment for the upcoming quarterly review meeting, a major event where department heads presented their achievements and plans to Daniel and the board of directors. Vanessa had delegated a portion of the presentation to Allison, giving her just 2 days to prepare. It wasn't just the short timeline that unnerved her. This was no small task. The section Vanessa had assigned was critical, a breakdown of potential risks in a key international expansion plan. Allison's pulse quickened as she scrolled through the dense data files attached to the email. It was a test, one she couldn't afford to fail. Allison dove into the work immediately, poring over spreadsheets and strategy documents. The language was dense, filled with industry-specific terms she wasn't yet familiar with. Each paragraph felt like a puzzle she needed to decode, and the pressure of knowing she would have to present her findings to Daniel himself added to her anxiety. By midday, her focus was interrupted by Vanessa's sharp voice. Allison, my office, Vanessa called as she walked past. Allison quickly grabbed her notebook and followed. Vanessa's office was a sleek, glass-walled corner space with a commanding view of the city. Vanessa gestured for Allison to sit, her expression unreadable. I wanted to check on your progress, Vanessa began, folding her hands on the desk. This presentation isn't just about numbers. It's about how you analyze them. Daniel expects insight, not just data. Allison nodded, her nerves flaring. I understand. I'm working on identifying key risks and... I hope so, Vanessa interrupted, her tone cool. Because if you can't handle this, it won't reflect well on either of us. The word stung, but Allison held her ground. I'll have it ready in time. Vanessa studied her for a moment before giving a curt nod. Good. Don't let me down. Back at her desk, Allison pushed through the afternoon. Determined to prove herself, she stayed late, the office growing quiet around her as most of the staff filtered out. At one point, Greg stopped by with a cup of coffee, his easy smile a welcome break from the intensity. Burning the midnight oil already, he teased, setting the cup on her desk. Something like that, Allison replied, grateful for the caffeine. Vanessa assigned me a section of the quarterly review presentation. Greg whistled softly. Oof, that's rough. She doesn't go easy on people. I've noticed, Allison said with a wry smile. But I'll figure it out. You will, Greg said confidently. If you need a fresh set of eyes on anything, let me know. His offer of help warmed her, but Allison knew this was a challenge she needed to face on her own. She thanked him and returned to her work, poring over the numbers until her eyes blurred. The next morning, Allison arrived at the office with her presentation slides ready. She had rehearsed her points in front of the mirror until she could recite them in her sleep. But as the review meeting loomed closer, her nerves began to creep in. When the meeting finally began, the conference room was packed. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his commanding presence filling the room. Vanessa presented first, her polished delivery setting a high bar. Allison's turn came next. She stood, her hands gripping the edge of her laptop as she connected it to the screen. The room seemed to shrink as all eyes turned to her. She took a steadying breath, forcing herself to remember Lisa's words. "Don't let fear stop you." "Good morning," she began, her voice clear but measured. "I'll be presenting a risk analysis for the proposed expansion into European markets." As she spoke, the words began to flow more naturally. She highlighted key risks, tying them to specific strategies that could mitigate potential challenges. She even referenced a clause in a recent trade agreement that could impact operations, a detail she had uncovered late the previous night. The room was silent, the air thick with concentration. When she finished, there was a beat of silence before Daniel spoke. "That was thorough," he said, his tone neutral. "Good work." Relief washed over Allison, but it was short-lived. Vanessa leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "I noticed you referenced the trade agreement," she said. "That's an important point. Where did you find it?" Allison hesitated, unsure if the question was a compliment or a test. "I came across it while reviewing recent updates from the European Commission," she explained. "I thought it might be relevant." Vanessa's lips curved into a faint smile. Impressive. The tension in Allison's chest eased as the meeting moved on. She had passed her first major test. Back at her desk later that day, Allison allowed herself a moment to breathe. The anxiety that had gripped her all week finally began to fade, replaced by a small but growing sense of confidence. She had faced her first hurdle and come out stronger for it. Her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Good presentation today. Keep building on that momentum." Allison stared at the screen, her lips curving into a smile, for the first time since joining Hughes Enterprises. She felt like she truly belonged. The next week brought a whirlwind of activity for Allison. She had earned her place at Hughes Enterprises, but the challenges kept coming. Every day was a balancing act. Meetings, reports, and the unspoken pressure of proving she was more than just a lucky hire. Still, she tackled each task with determination, fueled by the quiet pride of knowing she was making progress. One morning, as she was sifting through a series of financial projections, Daniel stopped by her desk unexpectedly. His presence always commanded attention, even in the bustling office. "Allison," he said, his tone as professional as ever, "I need you to join me for a client meeting this afternoon. It's with a potential partner in Hong Kong, and your language skills will be invaluable." Her heart skipped a beat. "Of course," she replied, masking her nerves. "What time should I be ready?" 2:00, he said, handing her a folder. "Review these documents beforehand. They'll want specifics." Allison nodded, her mind already racing as she flipped through the folder. The meeting was about a proposed logistics hub, a venture that could open up new revenue streams for Hughes Enterprises. The stakes were high, and she was determined not to disappoint. At 2 p.m., Allison found herself seated in a sleek conference room alongside Daniel and a few other team members. On the screen in front of them, the faces of the Hong Kong clients appeared via video call. Daniel opened the meeting with his usual confident demeanor, introducing the key points of the discussion. When the conversation shifted to Mandarin, Allison stepped in seamlessly, translating with precision and clarity. The clients were impressed, not just with her linguistic skills, but also with her ability to articulate complex ideas. At one point, one of the clients raised a concern about the project's timeline. Speaking quickly and using idiomatic expressions that might have tripped up a less experienced speaker, but Allison didn't miss a beat, addressing the concern in Mandarin with confidence. Daniel glanced at her, his expression subtle but approving. By the end of the meeting, the client seemed optimistic, agreeing to move forward with further discussions. As the call ended, Daniel turned to Allison. "That was excellent," he said. "Your ability to navigate that conversation made a significant difference." "Thank you," she replied, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I'm glad I could help." The team dispersed. But Daniel lingered. "You're adapting well," he said, his tone more personal now. It's not easy stepping into this world without prior experience, but you're proving yourself every day. Allison smiled, his words bolstering her confidence. It's a lot to take in, but I'm learning. He nodded. Keep it up. You're on the right track. Over the next few days, Allison began to notice a shift in how her colleagues interacted with her. The skepticism that had once greeted her was gradually giving way to respect. Vanessa, who had been one of her harshest critics, even stopped by her desk one afternoon to share insights on an upcoming project. I have to admit, Vanessa said, her tone almost begrudging, you handled that Hong Kong meeting better than I expected. You have a good instinct for this work. Thank you, Allison replied, genuinely surprised by the compliment. I've been learning a lot from watching you and the rest of the team. Vanessa gave a small smile. Keep that attitude. It'll take you far. The interaction left Allison feeling a rare sense of camaraderie. While she knew she still had much to prove, it was clear that she was beginning to earn her place among her colleagues. One evening, as Allison was wrapping up her work for the day, Greg stopped by her desk. Big shot, Reed, he teased, leaning casually against her chair. Word is you impressed the Hong Kong clients. Allison rolled her eyes with a laugh. I wouldn't go that far. I would, Greg said, grinning. You've been killing it lately, seriously. It's impressive. Thanks, she said, her smile softening. It's been a lot, but I'm trying. Well, if you ever need a break from all this corporate madness, let me know, Greg said. There's a great pizza place near here that makes everything feel a little less serious. Allison chuckled. I'll keep that in mind. Later that night, as she walked home through the city, Allison allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had come so far in such a short time. The fear and doubt that had consumed her when she first stepped into Hughes Enterprises were slowly being replaced by a quiet confidence. She wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. But even as she felt herself settling into this new world, there was a lingering sense that her journey was just beginning. The work was challenging. The stakes were high, and the path ahead was anything but certain. Yet, for the first time, Allison felt ready to face whatever came next. The city lights shimmered around her, casting a warm glow on the pavement. She had taken a leap of faith, and it was paying off in ways she hadn't imagined. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The office was buzzing the next morning, a quiet but palpable tension hanging in the air. Allison noticed it the moment she stepped into the building. Colleagues huddled in whispers near the coffee machine, heads turning subtly in her direction as she walked past. It wasn't outright hostility, but there was an edge to their curiosity that made her uncomfortable. As she settled at her desk, Greg appeared, leaning casually against the divider. "Morning, superstar," he said, his grin more subdued than usual. "Morning," she replied, setting her bag down. "What's going on? The office feels different today." Greg hesitated, his easygoing demeanor faltering. "You haven't heard." "Heard what?" He glanced around, lowering his voice. "Word's been going around that you only got this job because Daniel has personal interests in you." Allison froze, her stomach dropping. "What?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "It's just office gossip," Greg said quickly, raising his hands as if to calm her. "Don't let it get to you. People are just curious about how you landed here so fast." She stared at him, a mix of disbelief and anger bubbling inside her. "Curious, they think Allison," Greg interrupted gently, his tone sympathetic. "This place is full of ambitious people who hate seeing someone new rise quickly. Don't let their insecurities mess with your head." For the rest of the day, Allison tried to focus on her work, but the whispers and sidelong glances chipped away at her composure. She could feel the weight of judgment in the air, the quiet insinuations that undermined everything she had worked so hard to achieve. By lunchtime, she needed air. She grabbed her coat and stepped outside, the crisp Chicago breeze biting at her cheeks. The noise of the city was a welcome distraction, a reminder that the world outside the office was larger than the petty rumors swirling within. She found herself at a small park a few blocks away, sitting on a bench and staring at the pigeons pecking at crumbs on the pavement. Her mind replayed the conversations of the day, each whispered comment gnawing at her confidence. "Allison," the familiar voice startled her, and she looked up to see Daniel standing a few feet away. He was dressed in his usual sharp suit, his expression unreadable. "Daniel," she said, quickly standing. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same," he replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "But I'll assume you needed a break." She nodded, unsure of how much he knew about what was happening in the office. Before she could say anything else, he gestured toward the bench. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course," she said, sitting back down as he took the spot beside her. For a moment they sat in silence, the sounds of the city filling the space between them. Then Daniel spoke, his tone low and steady. "I've heard the rumors." Allison stiffened, her cheeks flushing. Stop," he said gently, holding up a hand. "You don't need to explain anything to me. I know why I hired you, and it had nothing to do with anything other than your abilities." His words were firm but kind, cutting through the fog of doubt that had clouded her mind all day. "Allison, this is the corporate world," he continued. "When people see someone succeed quickly, they look for reasons to discredit them. It's petty, but it's human nature." She nodded, her throat tight. "It's just frustrating. I've worked so hard, and now it feels like none of that matters." "It matters," Daniel said, his voice unwavering. "And the people who actually matter will see that. Let your work speak for itself. The rest will fall away." She looked at him, searching his expression for any trace of doubt, but found none. His confidence in her felt like a lifeline, anchoring her in the storm of uncertainty. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, standing. "Get back to the office when you're ready. And remember, you're here because you earned it." When Allison returned to her desk, something in her had shifted. The whispers and glances were still there, but she met them with quiet determination. She buried herself in her work, letting her performance do the talking. By the end of the week, she had completed a detailed risk assessment for one of the company's largest accounts, a task Vanessa had handed to her with a skeptical arch of her brow when Allison presented her findings. Vanessa gave her a rare nod of approval. "This is solid," Vanessa said, flipping through the report. "Well done." The compliment was small but significant, a sign that even her harshest critic was starting to see her value. Later that evening, as Allison packed up for the day, Greg appeared at her desk again, heading out. "Yeah," she said, slipping her notebook into her bag. "It's been a long week." He gave her a sheepish smile. "Listen, about the rumors. I'm sorry if I upset you earlier. I didn't mean to." She shook her head, her expression softening. "It's fine. I know you were just trying to help. Well, if it makes you feel any better, people are already starting to back off. That report you did, it's got people rethinking their assumptions." Allison smiled faintly. "Thanks, Greg. That means a lot." As she walked home, she reflected on the week's events. The rumors had shaken her, but they hadn't broken her. With Daniel's encouragement and her own perseverance, she had managed to rise above the noise. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace. She wasn't just surviving this world, she was thriving in it, one step at a time. The following week brought a welcome sense of normalcy to Allison's routine. The whispers in the office had largely faded, replaced by a cautious respect from her colleagues. Vanessa, who had initially been one of her biggest skeptics, had begun involving Allison in more high-level projects, subtly acknowledging her growing competence, yet, despite her professional progress, a gnawing curiosity had taken root in Allison's mind. Daniel's words from their conversation in the park lingered with her. "You're here because you earned it." She believed him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his confidence in her than he let on. Why had he taken such a personal interest in her success? One quiet afternoon, while sorting through a stack of financial reports, Allison received an email notification. The subject line caught her attention immediately. "Document request fulfilled, Reed Family Trust." She froze, her heart skipping a beat. A week earlier, in a moment of impulsiveness, she had submitted a request to an online archive for information about her family's financial history. It had been years since she last thought about the trust her parents had mentioned when she was a child. Something about a small inheritance tied up in legal complications. After their tragic deaths, those memories had faded into the background of her grief. She hesitated, her cursor hovering over the email. Finally, she clicked it, her eyes scanning the contents. Attached was a series of documents outlining the Reed Family Trust, its assets, and, most surprisingly, a record of suspicious activity dating back nearly 2 decades. Allison's pulse quickened as she opened the first document. The trust, it seemed, was far larger than she had ever imagined. What she had always assumed was a modest fund left behind by her parents was in fact a multi-million-dollar portfolio. But the records showed that large sums of money had been withdrawn over the years by an authorized guardian. Her hands trembled as she read further. The guardian in question was a distant relative, an uncle she barely remembered. The withdrawals began shortly after her parents' deaths and continued for years, draining the account almost entirely. The final entry, dated 5 years ago, marked the closure of the trust. Allison leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. How could this have happened? Why hadn't anyone told her about the trust, or the withdrawals? And most importantly, what had happened to the money? That evening, Allison sat in her apartment, the documents spread across her desk. Her emotions swung between anger and confusion as she tried to piece together the puzzle of her family's financial history. She barely noticed the time passing until her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Can you meet in my office first thing tomorrow? There's a new project I'd like you to take the lead on." Her initial instinct was to push the trust issue aside and focus on her work, but an idea began to form in the back of her mind. If anyone could help her make sense of the situation, or point her in the right direction, it was Daniel. He had access to resources she could only dream of, and a knack for uncovering the truth. The next morning, Allison arrived at Daniel's office promptly at 8. His assistant, Marcy, waved her in with a warm smile, and Allison stepped into the spacious room. Daniel was seated at his desk, reviewing a set of documents, but he looked up as she entered. "Good morning, Allison," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Thanks for coming in early." "Good morning," she replied, setting her bag down. "You mentioned a new project." "I did," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But before we get into that, is something on your mind? You seem distracted?" Allison hesitated, unsure how to begin. Finally, she took a deep breath and reached into her bag, pulling out a folder containing the documents from the Reed Family Trust. "There is something," she admitted, placing the folder on his desk. "I recently found out about a trust my parents left behind. It was supposed to be for me, but most of the money was withdrawn after their deaths, by someone I barely know." Daniel's expression shifted, his usual composure giving way to genuine concern. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the folder. "Of course," Allison said. He opened the folder, scanning the documents with practiced efficiency. As he read, his brow furrowed. "This is troubling," he said after a moment. "Whoever managed this trust had a legal obligation to protect your interests. What you're describing suggests serious misconduct, possibly even fraud." "That's what I was afraid of," Allison said quietly. "I don't know where to start or how to get answers." Daniel closed the folder, his gaze steady. "You start by holding people accountable. This isn't something you should have to handle alone. Let me make a few calls. I know someone who specializes in cases like this." "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," he said firmly. "This is important, and it needs to be addressed. We'll figure it out." The certainty in his tone was a comfort, and for the first time since uncovering the documents, Allison felt a glimmer of hope. By the end of the day, Daniel had connected Allison with Joseph Knight, a highly regarded attorney who specialized in financial fraud and estate recovery. Their initial phone call was brief but reassuring, and Joseph promised to review the documents thoroughly before their first official meeting. As Allison walked home that evening, the weight of the day's revelations pressed heavily on her. The trust issue was far from resolved, but for the first time, she felt like she had allies, people who believed in her and were willing to help her fight for the truth. The city lights flickered around her, a reminder of the life she was building in Chicago. It wasn't easy, but she was learning to face each challenge head-on. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she was determined to uncover the truth about her past. No matter where it led, the following week began with a sense of cautious optimism for Allison. The documents she had uncovered had left her shaken, but Joseph Knight's swift response brought a much-needed sense of direction. True to his word, the attorney had dived into the case with the precision of someone who had handled countless complex estate battles. "Allison, I've reviewed everything you sent me," Joseph said over the phone during their first official consultation. His voice was calm but carried an undertone of seriousness. "The transactions in this trust are not just questionable, they're blatantly illegal." "What does that mean?" she asked, gripping her phone tightly as she paced her small apartment. "It means your so-called guardian exploited their legal position to siphon money from the trust," Joseph explained. "We'll need to pursue this aggressively if we want to recover anything. The good news is, there are paper trails. The bad news is, it's going to be a long fight." Allison's chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What happens next?" "We file a formal claim," Joseph said. "I'll handle the legal groundwork. But you'll need to be prepared. Cases like this often involve pushback from the other party, and it's likely to get personal." "I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever it takes, I want the truth to come out." Joseph's tone softened. "Good. I'll be in touch soon." The call left Allison feeling both resolved and uneasy. She spent the next few days focusing on her work at Hughes Enterprises, grateful for the distraction. But even as she buried herself in spreadsheets and client meetings, the looming fight over her family's trust lingered in the back of her mind. One afternoon, Daniel called her into his office. The glass walls framed the city skyline, and the sun cast long shadows across the room. He was seated at his desk, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Allison," he began as she entered, "how's everything going with Joseph?" She appreciated that he didn't skirt around the topic. "It's moving forward," she said. "He's confident we have a strong case, but it's going to take time." Daniel nodded, leaning back in his chair. "These kinds of cases often do, but I've worked with Joseph before. He's the best at what he does." "Thank you for connecting me with him," she said sincerely. "I wouldn't have known where to start without your help." Daniel waved a hand dismissively. "You don't need to thank me, it's the least I could do." The conversation shifted to work matters, but as Allison left his office, she couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel's interest in her case went beyond professional courtesy. His support felt personal, almost protective. That evening, Allison attended an upscale networking event alongside the Hughes Enterprises team. It was her first time representing the company at such an event, and she felt the weight of the opportunity. The venue, a grand ballroom in downtown Chicago, was a dazzling display of opulence. Chandeliers glittered overhead, and the air buzzed with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. "Allison, there you are," Vanessa said, appearing at her side, dressed in an elegant navy gown. She looked every bit the seasoned corporate professional. "I wanted to introduce you to a few key players in the industry." Allison followed Vanessa through the crowd, grateful for her guidance. She met executives, investors, and even a few government officials. Each introduction a new chance to prove herself. Despite the intimidating atmosphere, Allison found her confidence growing with each conversation. Toward the end of the night, as the crowd began to thin, a man approached her with a warm smile. He was tall and impeccably dressed, with a polished demeanor that immediately put her at ease. "You must be Allison Reed," he said, extending a hand. "I've heard a lot about you." Allison shook his hand, curious. "I hope it's all good things." "It is," he assured her. "I'm Charles Bennett. I worked with your parents many years ago." Her breath caught, the noise of the ballroom fading into the background. "You knew my parents." "I did," Charles said, his expression softening. "They were brilliant, kind people. Your father was one of the sharpest minds in finance I've ever met, and your mother had a way of lighting up every room she entered." Allison felt a lump rise in her throat. It had been so long since she'd heard anyone speak about her parents in such vivid detail. "I don't remember much about their work," she admitted. "I was young when they passed." Charles nodded, a shadow of sadness crossing his face. "I'm sorry for your loss. They spoke about you often. You were their world." The conversation shifted as Charles shared anecdotes about her parents' careers, painting a picture of two people who were not only talented but deeply respected in their field. As he spoke, a sense of pride swelled within her. She had always known her parents were remarkable, but hearing it from someone who had worked with them made it feel more real before they parted ways. Charles handed her a business card. "If you ever want to talk more about them, or need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." "Thank you," Allison said, clutching the card tightly. "I really appreciate it." As the night wound down, Allison found herself standing near one of the grand windows. staring out at the city lights. The encounter with Charles had stirred something in her, a mix of longing and determination. Her parents had left behind a legacy, one that had been stolen from her. But now, for the first time, she felt like she was reclaiming a piece of it, deep in thought. Daniel's voice pulled her from her reverie. He stood beside her, a glass of champagne in hand. "Something like that," she said with a small smile. "I just met someone who worked with my parents. It was unexpected." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the past has a way of finding us when we least expect it." Allison glanced at him, wondering if his words carried a deeper meaning. But before she could ask, he raised his glass in a silent toast. "To moving forward," he said. "To moving forward," she echoed, clinking her glass against his. The following days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls with Joseph Knight, and moments of quiet reflection. The encounter with Charles Bennett at the networking event lingered in Allison's mind. His stories about her parents had reignited a sense of pride and curiosity about their lives, a curiosity that only deepened as she revisited the documents Joseph was compiling for her case. One afternoon, as Allison was preparing for a presentation, her phone buzzed. It was Joseph. "Allison," he said, his tone calm but serious. "I've uncovered something you need to see. Are you available to come to my office tomorrow?" "Yes, of course," she replied, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" "I'd rather explain in person," he said, "but let's just say it changes the scope of the case." The call ended. Leaving Allison on edge, she tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept drifting to what Joseph might have found. That evening, as she walked home, the city lights seemed sharper, the cool air biting against her skin. Something was shifting, and she could feel it. The next morning, Allison arrived at Joseph's office, a sleek space in a high-rise building downtown. He greeted her warmly and ushered her into a conference room, where a stack of papers awaited on the table. "What's this?" she asked, sitting across from him. "This," Joseph began, sliding a document toward her, "is the smoking gun." Allison scanned the document, her eyes widening as the details sank in. It was a series of emails between her uncle, the supposed guardian of the Reed family trust, and an offshore financial advisor. The correspondence detailed how funds from the trust had been funneled into private accounts and used to finance lavish purchases, including properties and luxury vehicles. "This is theft," Allison said, her voice trembling. "Blatant theft." Joseph nodded. "And it gets worse." He handed her another document, a report from a private investigator he'd hired. "Your uncle wasn't acting alone. There's evidence that other family members were complicit. They orchestrated this together, likely believing no one would ever look into it." Allison's stomach churned. She had always known her family was distant, but she had never imagined such betrayal. The thought of people she had once trusted conspiring to steal from her and her parents' legacy was almost too much to bear. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We take this to court," Joseph said firmly. "With this evidence, we can file a lawsuit for fraud and embezzlement. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but I'm confident we can win." Allison nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's do it." Back at Hughes Enterprises, Allison threw herself into her work, using it as a distraction from the emotional weight of her legal battle. The office had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where she could focus on tangible goals and temporarily set aside the chaos of her personal life. Daniel noticed the shift in her demeanor almost immediately. One afternoon, after a particularly productive client meeting, he pulled her aside. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone gentle but probing. "Is everything okay?" Allison hesitated. She trusted Daniel, but sharing the details of her family's betrayal felt deeply personal. Still, she sensed that he wouldn't judge her. "I've been dealing with some family issues," she admitted. "It's complicated." Daniel studied her for a moment before nodding. "If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." "Thank you," she said, offering a faint smile. "I appreciate that." That evening, as Allison reviewed her notes for an upcoming project, an unexpected knock at her door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone, and her cautious nature made her hesitate before opening it. When she did, she was greeted by a man in a dark suit holding a thick envelope. "Miss Reed?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, her guard immediately up. The man handed her the envelope. "You've been served." Allison's breath caught as she accepted the envelope, her hands trembling. She closed the door and sat at her desk, staring at the package for several moments before finally opening it. Inside was a notice of intent to countersue, filed by her uncle and the other family members implicated in the trust embezzlement case. The document accused her of defamation and breach of privacy, claiming she had no right to access the trust records. It was a blatant attempt to intimidate her, but it worked. For a moment, doubt crept in, making her question whether she was truly prepared for the fight ahead. But then she thought of her parents, their hard work, their legacy, and the dreams they had for her. This wasn't just about money, it was about justice. Setting the document aside, she picked up her phone and called Joseph. "They're countersuing," she said as soon as he answered. "I expected that," Joseph replied calmly. "It's a scare tactic. Don't let it rattle you." "It's hard not to," she admitted, her voice shaky. "I know," he said, his tone reassuring. "But remember, we have the evidence. They're trying to shift the focus because they know they're guilty. Stay the course, and we'll get through this." As the days turned into weeks, Allison balanced the demands of her job with the mounting pressures of her legal battle. The tension was exhausting, but it also fueled her determination. She began to see herself in a new light, not as the quiet girl who blended into the background, but as someone capable of fighting for what was right. One evening, as she worked late in the office, Daniel stopped by her desk. "Still here?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just finishing up," she replied, glancing at the stack of papers in front of her. He leaned against the edge of her desk, his expression thoughtful. "You're handling a lot right now." "I am," she admitted, meeting his gaze. "But I'm not giving up." "Good," he said, his voice steady. "Because the people who succeed are the ones who don't back down, even when it's hard." His words resonated deeply, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. As he walked away, Allison felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for her parents' legacy. She was fighting for herself, for the life she deserved, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. The tension in Allison's life felt like a constant hum, never quite fading but always present, like a low-frequency buzz in the background of her thoughts, between her mounting responsibilities at Hughes Enterprises and the looming legal battle against her family. It seemed there wasn't a single moment to breathe. Joseph's updates on the case came frequently now, each one more damning than the last. The evidence against her uncle and his accomplices was irrefutable. Bank statements, email exchanges, and even witness testimonies painted a picture of greed and betrayal. But their countersuit had escalated matters, forcing Allison into a grueling process of depositions and legal strategy sessions. One Friday afternoon, after another exhausting call with Joseph, Allison sat at her desk, staring blankly at her laptop. Her usually sharp focus had dulled, replaced by a haze of emotional and mental fatigue. Greg, always attuned to the energy in the office, noticed immediately. "Hey," he said, sliding into the chair beside her. "You've been looking like a zombie all week. What's going on?" Allison hesitated, unsure how much to share. Greg was a friend, but her family's issues felt too personal, too raw to casually explain. Still, the concern in his eyes softened her defenses. "It's complicated," she admitted, leaning back in her chair. "Let's just say I'm dealing with some major family drama on top of everything here." Greg nodded, his expression sympathetic. "That's rough. Anything I can do to help?" She shook her head with a faint smile. "Not really, but thanks. I'll get through it." "Well," Greg said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "if you need to blow off some steam, there's a group of us heading to O'Malley's after work. You should come." Allison hesitated. The thought of spending an evening at a noisy bar seemed overwhelming, but the idea of stepping away from her problems, even briefly, held its own appeal. "I'll think about it," she said. As the day wound down, Allison found herself lingering at her desk, debating whether to take Greg up on his offer. Before she could decide, Daniel appeared, his usual air of composure tinged with something softer. "Allison," he said, his tone warm. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course," she replied, standing to follow him into his office. The view of the city from Daniel's floor-to-ceiling windows was breathtaking, but Allison barely noticed. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was this about work? The case? Something else entirely. Daniel gestured for her to sit, taking the chair across from her instead of his usual place behind the desk. "I wanted to check in," he began, his voice steady but unusually personal. "You've been under a lot of pressure lately. Are you holding up okay?" The question caught her off guard. She had expected a discussion about a client or project, not a genuine inquiry about her well-being. "I'm managing," she said cautiously. "It's been a lot, but I'm handling it." Daniel studied her, his piercing gaze softening slightly. "You don't have to do it all alone, you know." Her defenses rose instinctively. "I'm used to handling things on my own." "I can see that," he said with a faint smile. "But even the strongest people need support sometimes. Don't be afraid to lean on the people who care about you." His words struck a chord, stirring emotions she had tried to suppress. For so long, she had prided herself on her independence, on her ability to navigate challenges without relying on anyone. But lately, the weight of everything had felt almost unbearable. "Thank you," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "That means a lot." Later that evening, Allison decided to join Greg and the others at O'Malley's. The bar was loud and crowded, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. It wasn't her usual scene, but there was something comforting about the camaraderie of her colleagues. Greg greeted her with a grin, sliding a drink across the table. "Glad you made it," she smiled, taking a sip of the cocktail. The conversation flowed easily, a mix of office gossip and light-hearted banter that allowed her to relax for the first time in weeks. For a few hours, she let herself forget about the lawsuits, the whispers, and the endless pressure to prove herself. As the night wore on, Greg leaned closer, his expression turning serious. "You know," he said, "you're one of the toughest people I've met. Whatever's going on with your family, I know you'll come out on top." Allison blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. "Thanks, Greg. That means a lot." "Anytime," he said with a shrug, raising his glass in a mock toast. "To Allison Reed, survivor of corporate chaos and family drama." She laughed, clinking her glass against his. The moment was light, but it carried a deeper sense of connection, a reminder that even in the midst of chaos, she wasn't entirely alone. The next morning, Allison woke with a renewed sense of clarity. The night out had been a brief reprieve, but it had also reinforced the importance of balance. She couldn't let the weight of her problems consume her. Joseph called later that day with an update. "The countersuit has no real legal standing," he explained. "It's a stalling tactic, and we'll address it in court. But we need to stay aggressive. The more pressure we apply, the harder it will be for them to fight back." Allison listened intently, her resolve hardening. "Whatever you need, I'm ready." "Good," Joseph said. "We'll win this, Allison. Stay the course." After the call, Allison sat by her window watching the city bustle below. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope. She had allies, both in the courtroom and in her day-to-day life, and she was learning to accept their support. She wasn't just fighting for her parents' legacy anymore. She was fighting for her own, and she was determined to see it through, no matter what it took. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, with its high ceilings and rows of polished wooden benches. Allison sat beside Joseph at the plaintiff's table, her fingers clasped tightly in her lap. The first formal hearing for the lawsuit had finally arrived, and despite her preparation, nerves twisted in her stomach. Across the room sat her uncle, flanked by his team of lawyers. His demeanor was confident, almost smug, as if he believed he could outmaneuver the evidence against him. Allison clenched her jaw, anger simmering beneath her fear. She wasn't here to back down. She was here to fight. Joseph leaned toward her, his voice low and steady. "Stay calm. We've got this." She nodded, taking a deep breath as the judge entered the room. The proceedings began, and Joseph took control. Presenting their case with the precision and authority of a seasoned litigator, he outlined the blatant misuse of the trust funds, pointing to the emails, bank statements, and transaction records that painted a damning picture of her uncle's actions. The defense, however, was quick to strike back. They painted Allison as an opportunist, claiming she had no knowledge of the trust until recently, and was only pursuing the case for financial gain. Their words stung, but she refused to let them rattle her. At one point, her uncle took the stand, his tone dripping with feigned innocence. "I managed the trust to the best of my ability," he said, his expression pained. "The funds were used for expenses related to Allison's care." Allison's fists tightened under the table. She wanted to shout the truth, to expose his lies, but Joseph gave her a subtle shake of his head, a reminder to stay composed. This was a long game, and emotions wouldn't win the day. When the hearing ended, Allison felt drained but resolute. Outside the courthouse, Joseph turned to her, his expression serious but confident. "They threw everything they had at us today," he said, "but they can't deny the facts. We're in a strong position. Do you think the judge sees that?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. "I do," Joseph replied firmly. "But these things take time. Be patient." Patience wasn't easy, especially when the stakes were so personal, but Allison knew Joseph was right. This was just the beginning of the battle. Back at the office, Allison tried to focus on her work, but the courtroom drama lingered in her mind. She had barely settled into her desk when Daniel appeared at her side. "How did it go?" he asked, his tone soft. "It was intense," she admitted. "But Joseph is confident." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Good. Let me know if you need anything." "Thank you," she said. Her gratitude genuine. His quiet support had been a constant source of strength, even when she didn't know how to ask for it. That evening, as Allison walked home, she replayed the hearing in her mind, dissecting every moment. The tension weighed heavily on her, but she reminded herself why she was fighting. This wasn't just about reclaiming stolen money. It was about restoring her parents' legacy and proving to herself that she was capable of standing up to those who had wronged her. As she turned onto her street, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Joseph. "We've received a subpoena for additional documents from your uncle's lawyers. They're trying to delay us further. Call me tomorrow morning to discuss." Allison sighed, the weight of the fight pressing down on her again. But then another message came through, this one from Greg. "Pizza and drinks at my place tonight. You in?" A small smile tugged at her lips. She typed back a quick reply. "Sure, I could use a break." Greg's apartment was cozy and filled with the smell of freshly baked pizza. A few of their colleagues were already there, laughing and chatting over drinks. The casual atmosphere was a welcome reprieve from the intensity of Allison's day. "Glad you made it," Greg said, handing her a slice of pizza. "You look like you needed this." "I did," she admitted, taking a seat on the couch. "Thanks for inviting me." As the night went on, the conversation turned to lighter topics: office gossip, favorite TV shows, and weekend plans. For a few hours, Allison allowed herself to let go of the tension she had been carrying, laughing and joking with her coworkers as if her life wasn't a tangled web of lawsuits and corporate pressures. The next morning, Allison woke with a clearer head. She called Joseph, and together they strategized their response to the subpoena. His confidence was infectious, and by the end of the call, she felt ready to face whatever the defense threw at them next. At the office, Vanessa stopped by her desk, a rare smile on her usually stern face. "I heard about the hearing," she said. "Sounds like you held your own." "I had help," Allison replied, her tone modest. "Even so," Vanessa said, her gaze steady. "It takes guts to stand up to something like that. Keep it up." The unexpected encouragement bolstered her, a reminder that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. Between Joseph's legal expertise, Daniel's quiet support, and the camaraderie of her colleagues, she had built a network of allies she could rely on. As the day wore on, Allison felt a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready for it. Her parents' legacy was worth fighting for, and so was her own future. The weeks that followed were a blur of court filings, strategy meetings with Joseph, and the relentless rhythm of work at Hughes Enterprises. Allison balanced the demands of her dual lives with a quiet determination, but the emotional toll of her family's betrayal weighed heavily on her. Each new revelation about the misuse of the trust funds felt like another wound, cutting deeper than the last. One afternoon, Joseph called her with an update. His voice carried a mix of caution and urgency. "Allison, I've uncovered something critical," he began. "It's about the circumstances surrounding your parents' deaths." Her heart froze. For years, she had accepted the official narrative. a tragic car accident caused by poor road conditions. But Joseph's tone told her there was more to the story. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's evidence suggesting the accident might not have been accidental," Joseph said carefully. "I've obtained police records and witness statements that indicate your uncle was in the area at the time, despite claiming otherwise. It's possible he had a hand in orchestrating it." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "You're saying he might have caused it?" "It's too early to say for certain," Joseph replied. "But the timing of his actions after their deaths, the control over the trust, the financial discrepancies, it raises questions. I'm pursuing more leads." Allison gripped the edge of her desk, her mind racing. She had always wondered why her uncle had been so quick to take control after her parents' deaths, but the idea that he might have been involved in their demise was almost too horrifying to process. "Keep me updated," she said finally, her voice shaking. "I need to know the truth." The revelation consumed her thoughts as she tried to navigate her day. During a quiet moment in the office, Daniel stopped by her desk, his sharp gaze softening as he studied her expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his tone laced with concern. "I feel like I have," she admitted, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "There's new information about my parents' deaths. It might not have been an accident." Daniel's brow furrowed. "That's significant. Do you have support? People you trust?" She nodded. "Joseph is handling it, but it's a lot to process." Daniel hesitated, then placed a hand on the back of her chair, a subtle but grounding gesture. "Take it one step at a time, and if you need anything at all, let me know." His words were a small comfort in the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She nodded, grateful for his steady presence. That evening, Allison sat in her apartment, sifting through old photos of her parents. Their smiles seemed so alive, so full of hope and promise. The idea that their lives had been cut short by something other than chance filled her with a mix of anger and sorrow. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Joseph. "I've secured a meeting with a key witness. Can you join me tomorrow afternoon?" "I'll be there," she replied, determination hardening her resolve. If there was even a chance of uncovering the truth, she had to pursue it. The next day, Allison and Joseph met in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Across from them sat an older woman, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her coffee cup. "This is Mrs. DeWitt," Joseph explained. "She was a neighbor of your parents and saw your uncle on the day of the accident." Allison leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What do you remember?" she asked gently. Mrs. DeWitt hesitated, her eyes darting between Allison and Joseph. "I remember seeing him near their house that morning," she said finally. "He was arguing with your father. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later, when I heard about the accident, it didn't sit right with me." "Did you tell the police?" Joseph asked. "I did," Mrs. DeWitt said, her voice trembling. "But nothing came of it. They said it was just a coincidence." Allison clenched her fists under the table, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. As they left the cafe, Joseph turned to her. "This is a significant lead. We'll need to corroborate it with additional evidence, but it strengthens our case." Allison nodded, her resolve hardening. "Do whatever it takes." Back at work, Allison threw herself into her projects with renewed focus, using the distraction to keep her emotions at bay. But the weight of the new revelations lingered, a constant undercurrent to everything she did. Vanessa, who had become a surprising source of support in recent weeks, stopped by her desk one afternoon. "You're working yourself into the ground," she said bluntly. "Take a break." "I'm fine," Allison replied automatically. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "You're good, Reed, but you're not invincible. Even the best of us need to breathe." The unexpected concern caught Allison off guard. She managed a small smile. "I'll keep that in mind." That evening, as Allison walked home, the city lights blurred through her tired eyes. She thought of her parents, their love and strength, and the legacy they had left behind. She thought of the betrayal that had stolen so much from her, and the fight she was now waging to reclaim it. The path ahead was steep, but she wasn't walking it alone. With Joseph's expertise, Daniel's unwavering support, and her own resilience, she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be, and when the truth finally came to light, she vowed to ensure that justice was served. The days leading up to the next court hearing were relentless. Joseph's team had uncovered more damning evidence, including financial transfers, linked to offshore accounts, and records showing Allison's uncle had misrepresented his role in the trust's management. But the revelations about her parents' deaths cast a shadow over everything. Each new piece of information felt like a puzzle piece sliding into place, forming a picture she wasn't sure she was ready to see. At Hughes Enterprises, Allison tried to focus on her work, but the weight of the case was impossible to ignore. Even her colleagues, who had grown accustomed to her quiet determination, noticed the strain. "Allison," Greg said one afternoon, leaning against the divider of her cubicle, "you've been running on fumes. Let me take you out for lunch, my treat." She shook her head with a faint smile. "Thanks, Greg, but I've got too much to do." He frowned, crossing his arms. "You can't keep going like this. Even superheroes need a break." "I'll survive," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "But I appreciate it." As Greg walked away, Allison's phone buzzed. It was a message from Joseph. "New lead on the accident. Call me when you're free." Her heart raced as she stepped into an empty conference room to call him back. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. "There's a pattern," Joseph said. "The financial discrepancies in the trust coincide with the weeks leading up to the accident. It looks like your uncle was trying to gain full control of the trust before your parents could stop him. And there's more. We found a witness who claims your father had been planning to report him for financial misconduct." Allison's grip on the phone tightened. "You're saying my father knew?" "It's possible," Joseph replied. "The timing lines up. Your father may have confronted your uncle about the trust, which could have escalated things." The thought made her stomach churn. Had her parents' deaths been the result of greed and desperation? The idea was almost too horrific to comprehend, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. The following morning, Allison met Joseph at his office to prepare for the upcoming hearing. The atmosphere was tense but focused as they reviewed their strategy. "We'll present the evidence about the trust first," Joseph explained, "then introduce the information about the accident. The goal is to establish a pattern of deceit and motive." Allison nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready." But as they worked through the details, a new thought crept into her mind. Her uncle had always been distant, but there was another family member who had been closer, an aunt who had occasionally visited when she was younger. Could she have been involved too? "What about my aunt?" Allison asked, her voice hesitant. "She was around during that time. Could she have known something?" Joseph tilted his head thoughtfully. "It's possible. Do you have any contact with her?" "Not since I was a teenager," Allison admitted, "but I can try to find her." That evening, Allison dug through old photo albums and records, searching for any clue about her aunt's whereabouts. Finally, she found a letter with a return address in a suburb outside Chicago. The handwriting was faded, but the name was unmistakable. Margaret Reed, the next day, armed with nothing but the address and a deep sense of determination. Allison drove to the suburb. The house was modest, with a neatly trimmed lawn and flower boxes under the windows. She hesitated for a moment before ringing the doorbell. The woman who answered was older than Allison remembered. Her hair streaked with gray and her face lined with age, but her sharp blue eyes were unmistakable. "Allison?" Margaret said, her voice tinged with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," Allison said, her voice steady. "It's about my parents and the trust." Margaret's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. She stepped aside, motioning for Allison to come in. The living room was cozy, filled with the scent of lavender and old books. Margaret gestured for her to sit, then settled into an armchair across from her. "I always knew this day would come," Margaret said after a long silence. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Allison replied. "I need to understand what happened and why." Margaret sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Your father discovered discrepancies in the trust shortly before the accident. He confronted your uncle about it, and things got heated. I wasn't there, but I heard about the argument later." "Why didn't you say anything?" Allison asked, her voice rising. "I was scared," Margaret admitted, her voice trembling. "Your uncle was ruthless. He made it clear that if I interfered, I'd regret it. I didn't know what to do, so I stayed silent. Allison's chest tightened with a mix of anger and sadness. Do you think he had something to do with the accident? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. I can't prove it, but I believe he did. Your father was going to expose him, and he couldn't let that happen. The words hit Allison like a blow, the weight of the truth sinking in. Her uncle's greed had not only stolen her inheritance, but had also taken her parents from her. Back in the city, Allison shared everything with Joseph, who quickly incorporated Margaret's testimony into their case. The revelations added another layer of complexity, but they also strengthened their position. At work, Daniel noticed the shift in her demeanor. You've been quiet, he said one afternoon, his tone gentle. I found someone who knew the truth about my parents, she admitted. It's a lot to process. Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that set us free. You're strong, Allison. Don't lose sight of that. His words stayed with her as she prepared for the next court hearing. The fight was far from over, but Allison knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't stop until justice was served. The next court hearing loomed like a storm cloud, its weight pressing heavily on Allison's shoulders. This time, the stakes felt higher than ever. Joseph had built a rock-solid case, but the revelations about her parents' deaths and her uncle's possible involvement added a layer of emotional intensity she hadn't anticipated. Allison arrived at the courthouse early, dressed in a sharp, dark suit that Vanessa had helped her pick out. It wasn't just about appearances. It was about projecting the confidence she needed to feel, even if her nerves were threatening to undo her. Joseph met her at the steps, his demeanor calm and reassuring as always. Are you ready? He asked, scanning her face. I have to be, she replied, squaring her shoulders. Let's do this. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Allison's uncle sat at the defense table, his expression cold and calculating. Beside him were his lawyers, flipping through files and whispering among themselves. Margaret sat quietly in the gallery, her hands folded in her lap, her presence a quiet reminder of the truth Allison was fighting to expose. Joseph began by laying out the financial discrepancies in the Reed family trust. His presentation was methodical, each piece of evidence building on the last until the pattern of fraud and embezzlement was undeniable. The defense tried to poke holes in the argument, but their counterpoints lacked the weight of the cold, hard facts. Then, Joseph introduced Margaret as a witness. The courtroom fell silent as she took the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she swore to tell the truth. Allison watched her aunt closely, a mix of gratitude and sadness swelling in her chest. Margaret's voice was steady as she recounted what she knew. The arguments, the threats, and the fear that had kept her silent for so long. Did you believe Allison's uncle was involved in her parents' deaths? Joseph asked, his tone measured. Margaret hesitated, her gaze flicking to Allison before returning to Joseph. Yes, she said quietly. I do. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. The defense scrambled to discredit her testimony, but Joseph's cross-examination left no doubt about her credibility. As the day wore on, Allison was called to the stand. Her palms were clammy as she took her seat, but she steadied herself with a deep breath. Joseph guided her through her testimony, asking her to recount her discovery of the trust documents, the steps she had taken to investigate, and the emotional toll the betrayal had taken on her. The defense lawyer was more aggressive, attempting to paint her as inexperienced and opportunistic, but Allison held her ground, her voice steady as she refuted their claims. You've worked hard to rebuild your life, Joseph said in his final question. Why did you decide to fight this battle? Allison looked directly at her uncle, her gaze unwavering. Because it's not just about the money, she said. It's about my parents' legacy. They worked hard for what they built, and I refuse to let greed and lies destroy it. The courtroom was silent as she stepped down, her words resonating in the heavy air. After hours of testimony and arguments, the judge called a recess, announcing that her decision would be delivered in the coming weeks. Allison left the courthouse feeling emotionally drained but resolute. She had given everything she had, and now all she could do was wait. Outside, Daniel was waiting for her, leaning casually against his car. His presence, as always, was a steadying force. You did well, he said simply, falling into step beside her as she walked toward her car. "Thanks," she said, her voice subdued. "It's just hard to believe it's almost over." Daniel glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Whatever happens, you've already won. You stood up for yourself, for your parents. That takes more strength than most people realize." His words struck a chord, and for the first time that day, Allison felt a small flicker of pride. She had fought for something bigger than herself, and that mattered. The following weeks were a blur of anticipation and routine. Allison threw herself into her work at Hughes Enterprises, grateful for the distraction. Vanessa and Greg both checked in on her regularly, their quiet support a source of comfort. Even Daniel, who rarely allowed himself to get too personal, made a point of asking how she was holding up. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. Allison sat in the courtroom beside Joseph, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The judge entered, her expression unreadable as she took her seat. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Allison Reed," the judge announced. "The evidence presented demonstrates clear misconduct in the management of the Reed Family Trust. Furthermore, the court recognizes the need for further investigation into the circumstances surrounding the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Reed. The defendant is ordered to return the embezzled funds and will face additional legal consequences as determined by the appropriate authorities." The words washed over Allison like a wave, the weight of her victory sinking in. Her uncle's face twisted in anger as he was escorted out of the courtroom, but she didn't spare him a second glance. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Outside the courthouse, Allison took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs. Margaret approached her cautiously, her expression tinged with guilt. "Allison," she said softly, "I'm so sorry for everything, for staying silent, for not being there for you." Allison studied her aunt for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you for coming forward," she said. "It means more than you know." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and Allison gave her a brief but sincere hug. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a step forward. That evening, Allison stood on the balcony of her apartment, staring out at the city lights. The battle had been long and painful, but she had emerged stronger. Her parents' legacy was intact. And for the first time in years, she felt at peace. Her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Congratulations, you earned this." Smiling, she typed back, "Thank you. For everything." The fight might have been over, but Allison knew her journey was just beginning. She had faced the fire and come out the other side, ready to embrace whatever came next. The days following the verdict felt like a blur of closure and transition for Allison. The legal battle was over, and the embezzled funds had been returned to the Reed Family Trust. Yet, as she sat in her apartment one evening, going through the final paperwork with Joseph, she realized that the fight had left her changed in ways she hadn't fully understood. "This is the last of it," Joseph said, handing her a folder. "The funds are officially back under your control. The court has also opened an investigation into your uncle's involvement in your parents' deaths. That's a separate process, but I'll keep you updated." "Thank you," Allison said sincerely. "I don't know how I would have done this without you." Joseph smiled, leaning back in his chair. "You would have found a way. You're tougher than you think." The following morning, Allison stood outside the Reed Family Foundation building, a modest space she had rented using the restored trust funds. For years, her parents had dreamed of creating a charitable organization to support underprivileged students, and Allison had decided to honor that dream. Inside, a small team of volunteers was busy setting up desks and unpacking boxes. Allison greeted them warmly, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose. This was her chance to not only preserve her parents' legacy, but to build something meaningful of her own. As she walked through the office, inspecting the progress, her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Swing by my office when you have a chance." Later that day, Allison arrived at Hughes Enterprises. Feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and excitement, the office had been her sanctuary during the most difficult period of her life, and Daniel had been a steadfast source of support. Now, with the legal battle behind her, she felt ready to focus on the future. Daniel was waiting for her in his office, his expression as calm and composed as ever. "Allison," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Good to see you." "Good to see you too," she replied, settling into the chair across from him. "What's on your mind?" He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "I've been watching the way you've handled everything. The court case, The foundation. Your work here. You've shown incredible resilience and vision. I'd like to offer you a new role." Allison blinked, caught off guard. "A new role? Director of Strategic Initiatives," he said. "You'd oversee projects that align with our long-term goals, particularly in areas like international expansion and community outreach. It's a significant step up, but I think you're ready." Her breath caught. The offer was more than she had ever imagined, a testament to how far she had come. "I'm honored," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. "I'd love to take on the challenge." Daniel smiled, a rare warmth in his usually reserved demeanor. "I had a feeling you'd say that." That evening, Allison met Greg and Vanessa for dinner to celebrate her new role. The small restaurant was cozy, its atmosphere alive with laughter and the clinking of glasses. As they toasted her promotion, Allison felt a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had stood by her through the hardest times. "You deserve this, Allison," Vanessa said, raising her glass. "You've earned every bit of it. Here's to taking over the world," Greg added with a grin. Allison laughed, clinking her glass against theirs. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax, to revel in the joy of a hard-fought victory. In the weeks that followed, Allison embraced her new responsibilities with the same determination that had carried her through her legal battle. She juggled her role at Hughes Enterprises with her work at the Reed Family Foundation, finding fulfillment in the balance between corporate ambition and personal purpose. One afternoon, as she was leaving a meeting at the foundation, she received an unexpected call. It was Charles Bennett, the man who had worked with her parents and shared stories about them at the networking event. "Allison," he said warmly, "I've been following your journey, and I have to say, your parents would be incredibly proud." Her throat tightened with emotion. "Thank you, Charles, that means more than I can say." "There's one more thing," he continued. "Your father left behind some personal letters and documents that he wanted you to have. They've been in my possession for years, waiting for the right time. I think now is that time." Allison's heart swelled. "I'd love to see them." A week later, Allison met Charles at his office, where he handed her a small, leather-bound box. Inside were letters written by her father, filled with advice, encouragement, and reflections on life. As she read them later that evening, tears streamed down her face. The letters were a window into the man she had lost, a reminder of the values he had instilled in her. One letter, in particular, stood out. It ended with a simple but powerful message. "Never let fear stop you. You are stronger than you realize, and the world needs your light." That night, Allison stood on her balcony, the city lights stretching endlessly before her. She thought of everything she had endured, the loss, the betrayal, the battles fought and won. She thought of her parents and their unyielding belief in her, a belief that had carried her through even the darkest moments. Her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Let's celebrate your promotion soon. Dinner on me?" Smiling, she typed back, "You're on." As she set her phone down, a sense of peace washed over her. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had brought her to a place of strength, clarity, and purpose. She wasn't just living in the shadow of her parents' legacy anymore. She was creating her own. And this was only the beginning.